Many of their films, if not all, have an opening chapter.
The world is full of complainers.
There's something that happens before action. The narrator doesn't make any sense. You're looking at these shots of Texas, and he's talking about, how things are in Russia.
In Russia, they got it mapped out so that everyone pulls for everyone else.
I like the kind of trickery of observing something and then being pulled into it. Being pulled in like that is the great sleight of hand of the writer, director, actor team that we become a part of.
Go ahead.
The music is based upon the samples of industrial sounds, what would otherwise be called sound effects. That's something that we come back to a lot, the blurring of the distinction between music and sound design.
When I suggested Joel and Ethan to give Carter a call, Carter said, "Why did you do that? What made you think I was capable of doing that?" From the very beginning, I had an inkling that they were interested in sound and music on a kind of more married level than two separate warring factions. And they were also interested in non-traditional music, non-orchestra. For Blood Simple, they were interested in a more sort of radical departure. And those are the reasons why I thought you could do it, by the way.
Okay.
You weren't just a rock and roll musician. You also had other tricks up your sleeve.
When Skip called me and said, would you be interested in doing music for a film? I think my first reaction was, yes, sure. I mean, I was doing it not for any reason other than what the hell, which I think is a good reason to do things. So I went and saw a couple of reels and then came home and thought, well, I guess I should probably try to learn something about film music. So I looked through TV Guide. Those were in the days of broadcast television, and saw that The Byrds was on television that day. So I set my VCR to record it. I really didn't know anything about film music. And at the end of every dramatic scene, I would go, I forgot to listen to the music. But I was recording it. So at the end of the film, I rewound and went back and realized that there isn't actually any traditional score in the film, that the film is entirely scored with sound effects and sort of electronic creations of bird sounds, and that Bernard Herrmann gets a credit as, I think, a sound consultant or something like that on it. Bernard Herrmann being Hitchcock's usual composer at that point in his career. There's no instruments in the traditional sense. And I think it was definitely fortuitous that would be my first lesson in film music. I'm very grateful that that's what it was, because that's stuck with me ever since. And certainly it informs our working relationship. The sound effects can play the role of score, whatever you think that role is, and vice versa. And as it so happens, as I've gotten more into this, what's become a career, I realize it's interesting. There's some parallels between Hitchcock and Joel and Ethan in the sense that they all take music very seriously. They take score very seriously, so seriously that they will question its presence. I don't remember what I was shown at first. It was only really one or two reels because it was a very casual meeting. There was no expectation. I do remember coming away thinking, these guys were the same age as me, just out of college, thinking, well, if they've made a film, I'm not sure what it's really all about, and they wouldn't tell me. Of course, they will never tell you. These days they will give me a script and we talk about it, but they're not the kind of people who will tell you, oh, the movie is all about this and this is the way the story works. Then they certainly don't like to discuss what the meaning of the film is, or
why Russia, for instance.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't remember coming away having any idea what was really going on in the film, but there definitely was a mood generated by the way it was shot and the pacing. Just a general sense of the amount of space, for instance. Not a ton of dialogue, not a ton of action, a lot of space. That was clear from what they showed me. I have to emphasize that I had never done this before, and I really had no idea what I was doing. I just put together lots of different ideas, some at the piano, some using synthesizers, reel-to-reel tape, and then just brought them back a couple of days later. Parts that I think in particular Joel and Ethan responded to were, the more unexpected, where it was either more emotional or just a little weirder sonically. And at that time, I was playing a lot with, also tape effects and what the technology at that time was, which was, for me, it's like tape and some primitive synthesizers and that very first sampling instrument. I don't recall having any further discussions about it or hearing anything until I was in Manchester recording and got a call. Because I think they talked to other composers. I think my impression was they felt they had a fiduciary responsibility to interview people who actually knew how to write film music. And they basically said, okay, you're getting back, can we go into the recording studio? So basically we used the things that I had written in those first couple of days. And I didn't have the technology to actually synchronize the music with the movie. I put a stopwatch on the piano and we needed a minute and 35 seconds, and I tried to make it work. I would sit at the piano in between takes and just extemporize, and they both grew more and more fond of the piano, and the whole concept of the score sort of over the course of those just days sitting there sort of moved a little bit farther away from the electronic thing, which it had been, and more towards the piano, which is, I'd say in a way like a metamorphosis that we've experienced in a number of films, because if you ask me, they don't typically write with the idea of emotion and human warmth being one of the, important features of their screenplays. It comes up sometimes, but often it happens because a particular actor, like Fran, will inject it. Here it is, their first film, and also working with Fran for the first time, and we began to realize while we were recording the score that the piano brought the characters together in a way, created human relationships in a way that I don't think any of us actually anticipated. What's unusual about it isn't the instrumentation. Piano is a perfectly traditional instrument. It's the use of piano against scenes that are dark and are, edgy and tense, and that became what was non-traditional in the score.
It was a really nice contrasting voice to the electronic stuff as well. They've always written a lot of sound direction in their scripts. Their scripts are very entertaining because they're very thorough. We absolutely took our cue from the tone of the movie. We just tried to push out there and be as gothic and radical as we could be. In those days, the kids were all interested in finding out the coolest sound to make anything, really everything. Just way over the top. Every gunshot was a gigantic, huge, loud thing followed by a gigantic canyon echo. And whether you were inside, outside, it didn't matter. It was like, let's go for the big one. As Joel is fond of saying, let's make this really hurt. We had atmospheres, and we tried to have a really nice stereo atmosphere. Even though it was mono, we tried to make it seem really kind of realistic and bold. But it was pretty subdued. The movie was pretty subdued sonically, so then even things like footsteps were kind of big and bold, relatively in contrast, and the balances were kind of skewed. And that was a kind of a experimentally playful process. It wasn't something that we constructed and wrote a diagram for. We created something which was filled with contrast. We have an obsession that we've done many times, and we've done several times as well together, is the driving thing. The way the car sounds, and you hear the different surface noises, how that is amplified by the tires, and then you hear kind of a thumpy sound, and that can be a rhythmic thing, and that can become part of a handoff to Carter.
I figure I better leave before I use it on him.
We've experimented with that on many movies, and they never get tired of that idea. You know, they're always like going, yeah, okay, well, maybe this time you guys will get it right, and we won't have to do it anymore. But so I think they used like 3 or 4 different cars. They borrowed one, and then that wasn't available the next day, so they had Barry's car.
Stop the car, right?
Like there's one shot where there's like a Volvo rolls into frame. Then the next shot, it's a Buick, and then the shot after that, it's like, okay, I get it. You know, they had restrictions. It was
It's
sort
a
of
it's a first film.
yes. The windshield wipers were very important in the opening of the film. The wipers are going pretty slowly, and there's kind of a tempo to that. And then the next shot, it's going a little bit faster. And then the next shot, it's going up like here, and now it's going like that. You know, so we're constantly having to like fudge the thing. I think we got them to change a few of them because they were so hard. And really, at that point, Carter's got this nice melody going, but there's really nothing. The rain on the roof and boosh, 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 boosh.
Houston.
We're just trying to wrench something fun out of what's really just a vehicle. You think you're all smart and you get all this stuff going, put it all together, and then it's like the most boring thing. It's like what the sound would have been like if they rolled sound during the dailies. You're like, oh, okay, I get it. That's like the bass line. Now we have to do the part that makes it a movie. They're really a big fan of like a grand unifying theory of sound rather than like a handoff. These are gunshots, that's the romantic cue, etc. If there's any way we can blur that together and make it a happy coincidence at the minimum, then they're thrilled with that idea. More so, they're pushing us always to make it much more sophisticated than that.
In this score, and I think a lot of other work I've done with Joel and Ethan, the music attempts to contrast two opposing ideas. I think the effect it has, hopefully, here is to tell you that the movie isn't really one thing or another. You know, you're not in just like a harsh, dark thriller, but there's other things going on, too. Another theme that comes in is very rhythmically driven. It's more with drums. An element of that one is actually these recordings Alan Lomax did of prison chain gangs, you know, like Parchment Farm recordings, things like that, but played backwards so that you don't exactly know what it is, but it's human. You could hear the humanity of it, but you can't identify really what it is. The nature of that landscape, it just looks like harsh and cruel. And the quality of the voices of the prisoners working seemed in some way to me like appropriate. It's, again, meant to just give you something you can latch onto, like the human voice, but at the same time also leave you uncomfortable because you can't actually tell what's being said or what's wrong with these human voices. So those are both elements of the music that have something to do with that landscape of Texas, but it's also very distanced from the landscape. It's not Texan music and it's not Texan sounds, but it relates, in my mind at least, in some way.
There's a fair amount of stuff in the film that there's some production for, which we copied and pasted, and there's some other stuff that we just did with Foley.
She came back here for you.
They had a bug zapper in the scene on the porch. And that became like an indication of where we were headed.
Hey, Marty.
Ceiling fans played a big part. The extension of that is all the noise, the stuff that's happening in the back room behind the bar.
Marty, thought you were dead.
All that backroom stuff is, I would say, mostly made up and foleyed and added later. Maybe the intention was to have the murder and all the parts of it be so agonizingly drawn out that we have to have something to go with here. It became fans, which became air conditioners and refrigerators and all sorts of stuff that we could just kind of sonically push the ball down the field a little bit in the smallest increments possible. And that allowed for a really kind of wonderfully languid score to play through all that and really focus, you know, like, this is horrifying, and it's going to go on for hours, you know.
An interest of mine at that time happened to be Balinese music.
Opal?
And I guess I must have introduced Joel and Ethan to the Ketchak, the monkey chant. We were talking about what do you do in these very hyped up scenes. The music can't be quite as meditative as, you know, a lot of the score is. And I played the monkey chant. Yeah, sure. It's so unexpected, and they liked it.
We had the limitation of no money. There are things that we do differently now that we would have done then if we had more money. Like now we routinely get a appropriate sounding vehicle and do the actions that belong in the film.
I'd like to see his face when he found the dead end.
I hadn't worked on very many films at that point, particularly not alone. And we were basically scrambling, as we all did, all through the final mix, just to get stuff pulled together and make something beautiful.
I think I knew that they were using songs in different areas of the film. It had no bearing on me at all. And indeed, they ended up having to change some of the songs when the video came out because they hadn't bought all of the rights.
The same old song, I think, was just too much. And so they had made sound-alikes. And they were in the original theatrical release, I think.
About the Ring of Fire.
The Patsy Cline song wasn't available. And the song starts off with the camera tracking down the bar, and there's a person who's passed out. And in the song, modulates up a half a step as the camera goes over, and then it goes back down to the original key. And I don't know if they shot that with that in mind, but it certainly fit perfectly, and it was very disappointing when it wasn't available. Well, it wasn't available because Jessica Lange and Ed Harris were doing that Patsy Cline movie called Sweet Dreams. So they said, no, you can't have that.
If you're working on low-budget films, you know, you'd make it and clear everything the best that you could, but maybe it wouldn't really be, you know, 100% because you didn't. What were the odds that it was ever actually going to make it to, you know, the next step and the next step?
Later, in 2000, we made that version. We put back all the original intended songs.
We must have, at some point going through the film, I must have done that with them when I got back from England and talked about where music goes. But at the same time, I have to say, when I first saw the finished film, music was in all these places I hadn't expected it to be. It was, you know, so I don't know how much of a real spotting session we had. I mean, I'm sure it was just me writing down with a yellow pad, you know, 35 seconds of music here.
I recollect that you were given orders, basically, like a short order cook. I'll have this one on rye, basically, which is the way that they approached the sound part as well.
When I saw the first screening after the final mix, I just remember music being in places that I hadn't expected it to be, processed in ways I didn't expect. And I believe my first words to Joel what have you done to the music? Today, it's one of my favorite films and one of my favorite scores. But I didn't really understand the process at the time, I'd be the first to say it. The question of whether the music should be creating continuities or pointing up changes of scene or cuts, you know, these sorts of questions. I don't feel like there's any one philosophy at play, and that it really does depend on the film and I'm trying to think of a better word than feel, but, you know, there are times when the music at least is trying to run a thread through a lot of different things.
I think they have a constitutional obligation to each film, and it's not the same one as the one before or the one after necessarily. It's a really interesting moving target. Like, Joel sometimes will say, yeah, we want to smooth this out and make it kind of dreamy. And then another time Joel will say, yeah, we really ruined that last time. We just need to make it harsh and sharp, you know. And then sometimes Ethan will say, no, that was bad what we did last time. Let's do something different.
I certainly didn't think when I started working on Blood Simple that I was going to be composing music for films 30 years later. And indeed, I continued to do other things for quite a while after Blood Simple came out. But of course, it did change my life because, you know, I love film and I love music, and the opportunity to be able to do the two together, I just feel very lucky. So even though there are, of course, many frustrations, and I should say, you know, I worked, the first couple of films I did were with Joel and Ethan, Blood Simple and Raising Arizona. The first time I actually had to work in Hollywood, I couldn't believe how awful that was, and how lucky I had been, you know, to have begun with them. And indeed, if the first film I had ever done was in the Hollywood system, I don't think I would have kept doing it. But they're so, you know, honest and transparent and smart and funny that I may not work with anyone else ever again, but I'm certainly happy to keep working on their films for, you know, until I expire.
Anytime you meet two pretty smart young kids who made something, I think you got to pay attention to that. And we really have a similar humor at the same age, and so we're all kind of peas in a pod in a way. It was an easy kind of brotherhood to make. The movie was so much fun to work on. It was clear to me that it would make a good film. Breath of fresh air from the other films that were being made at the time. So it seemed like an obvious roll of the dice. One thing that was an endearing quality that that they still do, and that is they laugh in a funny way. Have you ever heard that? Okay, so if you get both of them going, it's just, you can't say no to two like braying donkey type dudes. It's just that would be cruel.